All right, so with openings, I can't play everything, so I would like to play a Sicilian in this game. And we face a c3 Sicilian. Generally, I'm on the white side of this opening, but here we're on the black side, and as you guys know, I've said this many, many times, black has two main moves, d5 and knight f6, both of which immediately contest the center. In this particular game, I would like to play knight f6 because this is actually what I play IRL. This is my main move. And if you are familiar with the Alekhine, this is a similar, it's like you're playing the Alekhine with the inclusion of the move c5 and c3, which clearly favor black because the pawn on c5 controls the center, the pawn on c3 deprives the knight of that square, and just like in the Alekhine, you go knight d5. So this is very standard theory, and generally white goes either d4 or knight f3. Okay, so first things first, we should take this pawn, because if we don't take it, white will take our pawn, and there's no need to give white that opportunity. So we take the pawn, and actually it turns out white doesn't have to take back immediately if he doesn't want to, because the knight on d5 was x-rayed by the queen. How to approach this position? Black has many viable setups here. There are setups connected with the move e6. You can play knight c6. But I think that the most straightforward way of continuing here is to basically say, all right, well, white's got this pretty impressive pawn center. We want to kind of cut into it. We don't want to let white solidify that pawn center, which would potentially make our position kind of cramped, right? So what does it mean to like counter our opponent's center? Well, we want to try to break up this pawn chain. Ideally, we would hit the pawn on d4, but we can't do that. We already traded our pawn on c7. So the next best thing is to play d6. And, if white takes it, then we take with the queen, and we've got a great blockade on d5. That is why the c3 Sicilian often leads to isolated queen pawn or IQP positions, because if this trade occurs, which it just did, this is a classic IQP position. I've talked about it many, many times. And if we're facing an IQP, the most important thing, generally speaking, is to have the square in front of it controlled, preferably by a knight, which is exactly what we have here, which is why taking on d6 is it's not a big mistake, but it's not the most testing option. Okay, so how should we continue? Well, here we should complete our development as efficiently as possible. So let's begin by developing our knight to c6. Obviously. We need to develop this bishop and the other bishop. And based on how white plays, we'll figure out where to put those pieces. Why d6 and not f6? Well, because f6 is very weakening. Generally, playing the move f6, as Ben Feingold will tell you, is very committal. That weakens this diagonal. There's no need to do that when we can do it in the center. Never play f6, particularly not that early in the game. All right. So generally white plays knight c3 here, or he can develop this bishop. Yeah, knight c3. Okay. So we need to figure out what our development scheme is going to be here. And in order to do that, we have to determine which bishop we're going to develop first. Are we going to work on this bishop first by playing g6 or e6, or are we going to develop the light squared bishop first? Well, the move e6 is very solid here because it supports the knight. It prepares to get the bishop out to e7. Pretty decent move. Absolutely. The drawback of the move e6 is, as you can see, that the bishop on c8 is blocked in by the pawn. Although you could argue that later on you could fianchetto that bishop as well. Maybe you can. But I could see a stronger case being made, as we often like to do, for developing this bishop outside of the pawn chain first, and then playing e6 so that the bishop is free to roam and free to control the center of the board. Where to put this bishop? Well, we can put it on g4 and pin the knight. Pretty decent move. Or we can put it on f5, which is a pretty nice square for the bishop in these types of positions. I think you guys probably lean toward pinning the knight, which contains some interesting complications, but I'm going to do that. Let's pin the knight. How do you determine, and a lot of people have this question, like how do I know whether to play e6 or g6? Well, I don't. And the move g6 is a pretty decent one in this position. I'm going to write this down, and after the game I will explain in greater detail why I don't want to play g6 specifically here. There are a couple of reasons. that I don't like g6 as much. But generally, there's no formula for deciding whether to put the bishop on e7 or to fianchetto it. It all depends on the position. But here we're going to go e6. Partially, I like that this solidifies the knight even further. And g6, there's a sense in which it's a little bit slow, although both of these take 2 moves to develop the bishop. Okay, h3. Now, should we take the knight here? What do you guys think? Should we take the knight here? No, that's a bad trade. It brings white's bishop to a more active spot. That's pretty basic stuff. We should just drop it back. There's no need to trade. Unless you are specifically winning the d4 pawn, trading in this type of position is not advisable. And even if you are, giving up such a bishop can backfire pretty spectacularly. Okay, so he's probably going to castle. We're going to go bishop e7. And then we are going to castle at first opportunity. So essentially, we've completed our development. We have a great position, blockading knight on t5. And our plan is going to be to start pressuring this isolated queen pawn. That is white's only big weakness, and we've got it blockaded. So we're going to have to mount some sustained pressure on that pawn, trying to win it eventually. Wow, Zarkon, that's awesome. Congrats. Okay, rook e1. That doesn't change anything, so it's time for us to castle. Well, castling queenside is not a good idea here, largely because the c file is semi-open and it's going to be occupied by white's rook. And that gives white essentially a ready-made attack. Okay. So one of the positives for playing against an isolated queen pawn is if you have it blockaded, the moves are quite automatic. Like, in order to improve black's position, you've got several moves which just kind of play themselves. One of them is to bring the rook into d8, building more pressure on the pawn and reinforcing the knight. Someone suggested the idea of rerouting the bishop to c7 in order to build a potential battery. That's a pretty creative idea. But one of the good ways that you can test whether an idea is good or not is imagine that your opponent lets you play all of the moves you want to play. Then you look at the final position and you basically say, well, in that resulting position, will my opponent have some way to take the sting out of my idea? So let's apply that to the plan just proposed. Let's imagine that our bishop moves from e7 to c7 here, and it's white to play. Does white have anything unpleasant in that resulting position? I think a lot of you guys are seeing it. There's the move knight b5, which trades off the bishop, defeating the entire purpose of getting it there in the first place. So you might say, well, then let's play a6 first, and then get our bishop to c7. That's already 3 moves. And that's a pretty long time. And I've talked about the 3-move rule, which is a good way to estimate whether your ideas take too long or not. I think if an idea takes 3 moves or longer and the position is pretty open, generally it's going to be on the unrealistic side. Okay, bishop g5. So that's what I would call a positional mistake. What is a positional mistake? Positional mistake is a move that's not a blunder. But although this one borders on being a blunder, I don't think it is, though. But it is strategically wrong. Like, it helps us accomplish our plan, or it is to the detriment of, the positioning of the pieces. As I've talked about before, in an IQP structure, who benefits from minor piece trades? Is it the side with the IQP or the side playing against it, and why? You don't have to type out your answer, just think about that for a second. Yeah, so we benefit from it. The side playing against the IQP generally benefits from minor piece trades. Why is that? Well, the simple explanation is that the more pieces disappear off the board, the harder it's going to be to defend the pawn on d4. White's going to have to allocate. Like, imagine if white just has a queen and a rook. Well, then both of those pieces are going to have to be tied down to the defense of the IQP. And white's not going to have any pieces left over for any kind of active operations. There's a very famous Karpov-Korchnoi game where that happened. I've shown it before on stream. Now, that doesn't always happen. That doesn't mean you never want to trade. if you have the IQP, but that's what's going to happen here, I think. So as black, we want to trade off as many many minor pieces as possible. We can do that in two different ways. A lot of you are seeing that we can take the knight first. That seems to win a piece, but it doesn't. Because white takes the bishop on e7 first. We have to recapture, and then the bishop takes f3. I don't want to leave white with an uncontested light squared bishop on f3. So I would like to take this first. And then once the knight takes, I would like to trade the bishops as well, leaving us with just 4 knights on the board. Now you might be like, well, are IQPs ever good? Well, they are. And if you have an IQP, the most skilled players know how to handle it in a way to produce attacking chances. There are some brilliant attacking games where the side of the IQP either pushes it with a breakthrough or creates kingside chances. So it's not good or bad. It's just a complicated structure. Isolated queen pawn. But if you don't know, you could Google it. I'm pretty sure it'll pop up. Why not keep the light squared bishop? Well, as I just explained, it's all about sort of long-term strategy. We're trying to trade off pieces. All right. So this is a good time to refresh the idea of one move threat-itis. I can guarantee that a lot of you are thinking about going h6 here. At least you want to play h6. Or you want to play queen f4. Queen f4 is a better move than h6, but I don't like either of them. Well, it is a double attack. So queen f4 is a double attack on the knight and the pawn. But you're kind of taking your eyes off the football a little bit. You're taking your eyes off of the d5 knight. No, I like the move queen f4. It just has to be calculated. So after queen f4, white can play knight takes d5. And then in that position, which of the knights do we actually want to take? After queen f4, knight takes d5, do we want to take the d5 pawn knight with a pawn or the g5 knight with a queen? We definitely want to take the g5 knight with a queen, because if we take the d5 knight with a pawn, the pawn structure becomes symmetrical. White's knight can drop back to f3, and we will be unable to win the d4 pawn. The position becomes equal. It's only by taking on g5 that we preserve the IQP for white. All right. So that's one option. What are the other options here? I think we've got one other really good option, which is just to make a very simple improving move. You don't really need to do anything here. All that you want to do here is improve your position and increase the pressure on the pawn. I've already mentioned this move. What am I talking about? Just rook a to d8. Why there? Because that rook and the queen are going to be stacked up. And once the knight moves away from d5, the pressure on d4 might get unbearable. Now you might be thinking, well, isn't it a problem that we're leaving the knight on g5? Well, that knight in and of itself is not dangerous. Even if white brings the queen up to d3, you might be scared of the mate threat, but that's not a scary threat. You can just play pawn to g6. And white lacks the minor pieces to really exploit the weakness of the squares. Why not the f rook to d8? Well, I wouldn't play rook f d8 because it would leave the king a little bit too undefended. It would leave no pieces surrounding the king. But didn't you just say that the king is not in any danger? Well, yes, but partially that's because we would leave one rook to supervise the f7 pawn, make sure there are no shenanigans with knight takes f7. Rook f d8 is not terrible, but I wouldn't feel safe leaving my king like this. Why wouldn't you play knight f6? I feel like it's too early to release the blockade on the pawn. But what I would worry about in the event of knight f6 is white actually pushing that d-pawn in a particular situation. I don't want to allow that option. So let's go rook a d8. Queen f4 would have also been great, but I want to show you guys the power of just keeping the tension and making these simple moves. Knight f4 is similarly hasty because white can play rook d2, and you're kind of helping white pile on the defenders on the pawn. And that knight on f4 is going to be a loose cannon. It might get attacked, and it's not all about making moves that look aggressive. Yeah, but I'm blocking the IQP. That's a good thing. That's called a blockade. And we're only going to unblockade the pawn when we're ready to capture it. That's the point of a blockade. Okay, so he goes queen d3. And we will now go pawn to g6, blunting the queen. Now, under which circumstances would a move like g6 be bad? Well, if, for example, white still had a dark squared bishop, weakening these squares would be very dangerous. It could potentially lead to a lobster pincer mate. I wouldn't want to do that. Here, yeah, maybe a knight could land on f6, but we've got enough pieces nearby to make sure those are defended. And notice how it's all very relative to the pieces that remain on the board. Whether something is a serious weakness or not depends entirely on what's left on the board. Like, can your opponent exploit it? So make sure you're not thinking too generally about like weak squares. Knight f4 is also a big threat here, as you guys are indicating. Okay. So hopefully everything makes sense so far. Yeah, so weakness is one if it can be exploited. That's absolutely correct. I believe the black is slightly better here. Not much better, but slightly better for sure. Why play g6? Because white was threatening checkmate in one move. Two attackers on h7. All right, so we're waiting on our opponent to make a move here. The IQP is definitely becoming more of a weakness than a strength. All right. Yeah, he's playing very well so far. Knight takes d5. Okay, obviously queen takes d5. That's the whole point of what we've just done, which is to keep the d file open. Gila gifting to Tommy. Knight back to f3. Well, our strategy has triumphed. We are now ready to take the pawn. 1, 2, 3 attackers and only 1, 2 defenders. It all checks out. We can take the pawn. The thing to understand is also that like when you have an IQP, we won a pawn. Is the game over? Like, obviously it's not over. The game has just begun in many ways. We're still going to have to win potentially an endgame up a pawn, but at this level, you know, things do not come easy. You're not just going to win every game with checkmate. That's what a positional game is you got to win it gradually. So we'll see if white trades queens or not. In either case, white is down a pawn. Now we need to transition to the second stage, which is the technical phase of the game, where we try to convert our advantage. Queen b3, good move. Refusing the trade. Okay, so the pawn is currently attacked. We've got a million ways to defend it. The important thing about these positions is that you don't want to get too bogged down trying to be ultra precise. Generally, there's going to be 2 or 3 good moves. Thank you for the $1. In each position, so you shouldn't waste 5 minutes deciding between b6 and rook d7. I like rook d7 because it prepares tripling rooks. In such positions, you also kind of want to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Like if you're defending the pawn, you might as well prepare another improvement of another piece. So rook fd8 is coming. We're going to be tripled on the d file. Always good to be tripled on an open file. Yeah, queen d5 was also fine. Again, if you're asking a question of the form, why not this move? Chances are in this position, that move is also fine. Even b6 is totally normal. You can play b6 here. Queen d5 is great as well. Even queen d3 was a nice move, which I missed. That could have forced a queen trade. But not saying that black necessarily wants a queen trade here. We're happy to keep the queens on the board for now. We're happy to keep the queens on the board. Our queen is great. And when the time comes, we can play queen d3 and trade if we want to. So understand that, you know, whether or not there are alternatives depends on the position. In some positions there are, in some positions you kind of have to be accurate. Rook c2, great move. He's playing very, very well. Not making it easy on us. All right, so what does white want here? It's hard to say. I mean, rook c8 might be a little bit annoying. In fact, rook c8 is quite annoying. Rook c7 is perhaps even more annoying than rook c8 is, because that could create some issues with our pawns. And I see a nice indirect defense against rook c7. So I'm going to play the move, and I'm going to explain it afterward. I'm going to go king g7. This is a multi-purpose move that defends against both rook c7 and rook c8. Why does it defend against rook c8? It doesn't physically defend against it, but it takes the sting out of rook c8, because we'll be able to take that rook. Thank you, Lafong, for the raid with a party of 141. We'll be able to take that rook, and when white recaptures, it's not going to be check any longer. What does that mean? Well, that means we have a move, and we can use that move to trade queens on d1 if you calculate the line. Welcome, everybody. We're doing a speedrun game. Thank you, Lafong. But what about rook c7? What have I intended here? Well, against rook c7, that's a little bit more complicated to explain. This is a more tactical idea. He doesn't play it. I'll explain it after the game. Queen f3. Okay. Well, again, a couple of things that we can do. But I really like the idea of moving the queen away from d4 in order to give the rooks greater control over the d file. That queen is kind of in the way. Where would we bring the queen to? Well, I like the idea of going queen f6, because that seems to be a nice follow-up to the previous move, king g7, right? The queen is very nicely out of the way here, but it's not out of the game. It's looking at that b2 pawn. It's doing stuff. And if white doesn't trade queens, we're just going to slowly improve our position until we see a chance to make further progress. There's no algorithm for winning these positions. You got to be super patient. You got to make small improvements. Eventually, a chance will present itself if you're playing a human being, which hopefully you are. Okay. So already here we have an opportunity, which we could exploit or not. It's not clear whether it's a good idea or not, but you should at least notice that it exists. What am I talking about? Yeah. So we can give a check on d1 and trade a pair of rooks. I don't particularly like that idea. Why not? Well, let's calculate. Rook d1, rook takes d1, rook takes d1, king h2. What happens in that resulting position? Well, if you look very carefully, you'll see two things. First of all, a7 is hanging, right? Second of all, we have left the 7th rank, which means that white's rook on c2, which has not been traded, could potentially emerge on c7, starting to create threats against our queenside pawns and maybe even against our king. So I don't see the rush in going rook d1. I feel like that's not a move white is going to be able to prevent in the long term. I much prefer making the calm move b6. Let's defend the pawn. Let's create a little pawn chain, and maybe later we'll play rook d1. a6 was also good. a6 or b6, I think, are probably equivalent. Maybe even a6 is stronger than b6, but it really doesn't matter. Okay. We're slowly bleeding white's clock. He's going to have to work a lot harder than we will, keeping tabs on everything. Now, you might be looking at this and saying, well, this is a pretty boring game. But hopefully, if you're listening to me talk about the logic, you'll actually see that a lot goes into these simple-looking moves. And if you engage with the position, you will also find these positions more interesting than they seem. Now I am intending a move which you'll see a lot of GMs play. This is like a classic move. A lot of people look at it and say, I don't understand this move. I'm never going to be able to play such a move. But it's a very nice way to improve our position. And that's the move h5. Now, what's the point of it? It's not to create luft, right? Because our kings the back rank is not an issue. The point is to advance this pawn all the way to h4 and clamp down as much as possible on white's kingside pawns. This is really good in an endgame where pawn mobility is important. And this is even good with all of the pieces on the board, because in some alternate universe, you might envision a situation where white's king is on h2, and we essentially take away its escape square on g3 by doing this. Okay, so a5, that's a very strange move. I don't see any reason that we shouldn't just take this pawn. And yes, we have doubled pawns, but it's still an extra pawn. So, you know, an extra doubled pawn is better than no extra pawn at all. And a7 is protected, obviously, so he can't take that pawn either. Yeah, this is in the category of like random pawn moves, but in the absence, all things held equal, grabbing some space is not a bad idea, provided that you don't weaken that pawn. Yeah, we are in the territory where giving a check on d1 might actually be a good thing now. All right. Rook c5, and that is kind of just collapse, because now this gives us another pawn on b2. That's why we put our queen there. And now he's starting to hang a lot of pawns. And that's just what happens. This is how these games often go. You put pressure, 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 and then kind of this general collapse tends to happen, and it's totally normal. Okay, what do we do now? Well, now is a perfect opportunity to do what? Well, we can push the pawn. Yeah, we can go a4. But I would also even argue that a check on d1 could simplify the position. Now we're in the territory where trading is great, and we actually have the opportunity to checkmate him. If you look really carefully, that king on h2 could be checkmated on h1. We can't go rook h1 here. We have to defend that square with the queen, so we'll have to double on the first rank. So do we go queen b1? Well, queen b1 is sloppy, because queen b1 relinquishes the long diagonal. Remember how important it is to control this diagonal. White's got a lot of checks on that diagonal, so we want to make sure we go queen a1. Also, we protect this pawn. That's not that important, but it's something. And now we're threatening checkmate. We're up 3 pawns. This is winning. We're just going to have to be precise until the end. Okay. Rook takes h5 does nothing. It doesn't defend against mate, but it's a good thing to notice. This is essentially resignable. This is essentially resignable. Yeah, queen e5 check would trade queens, but then we're just up 3 pawns. So it's stuck between a rock and a hard place. Queen c3 check, same thing. Okay, here we have a very accurate move. You guys should know that rooks belong behind passed pawns in the endgame. But it seems that it's impossible to put the rook behind the pawn because there's a lot of traffic, but it's not. We have this really elegant move, rook t6, get it to a6, and then start pushing, tying down white's rook. White has to be stuck in front of the pawn, which immobilizes, and then we bring our king to that side of the board. This is a really cool, like, the rook is sandwiched between the 2 pawns. You don't even care. We could remove the a7 pawn from the board. That would change nothing. The important thing is this a5 pawn. That's the one that's going to be doing the heavy lifting. Yeah, thanks, Nivino. And yeah, if you enjoy this kind of content, the support has been tremendous, and I really appreciate it. All of the subs and all that stuff really helps, so thanks to everybody. Okay, rook a6. It's September, so give me your damn sub. No, just kidding. Okay, king g3, and obviously we just push. And we push all the way to a2. Okay. Not kidding at all. Why would I ever be kidding? Okay, just watch for moves like rook c6. So never pre-move, like never pre-move in these positions. Brooke, thank you for the prime. See, I got to somebody at least. Okay, so what's the actual winning strategy here? And it's not embarrassing to be like, I don't really know what we need to do here. The winnings, there's many ways that we can actually win. Well, you don't want to move this rook away from a6. You want to get white to trade on a2, because that would get into a pawn endgame. We're up a million pawns. First thing though is to get the king up. Without the king being in the action, you're not going to get anything valuable done. And the secondary step is to mobilize the majority, as somebody is saying. So let's give a check on a4, toss the king back. Let's toss the king back. And then let's start, you know, getting the pieces to the party. So first, we can bring our king up to f5. And then we can start pushing the pawns. With the ultimate aim of creating a passer on the king side as well. Okay, so here, yeah, g5. I'm going pretty fast here. This is very intuitive. I don't think this is like anything difficult. Well, I didn't want to go king e5. I'll show you why I wanted the king specifically on f5. There is actually a reason. Yeah, this is over. King c4. Okay, let's take it. And, you know, one approach is to go rook a3 and just pick off all these pawns. And we could even give up a2 if it means taking the other two pawns. I mean, this is just resigns. Yeah, good game. Good game. All right. So let's quickly go over it. Okay, d4 takes, d6. Yeah, so this is one of the topical positions of the Alapin. In fact, the modern move is to play knight f3 here. Yeah, you're very welcome. And black can't take on c3 because the knight hangs. So this is considered, I think, a little bit more precise. Although you could obviously take. Okay, so e takes d6 is not the greatest move, but it's fine. This is not the reason that white lost. Okay, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, bishop g4. One thing that you have to be careful about in these types of positions is the move. Thank you, Blundersmore, for the 9 months. Whenever you move your bishop out of c8 like this, it leaves the b7 pawn a little bit loose. So what move do you always have to check for when you get that bishop out in this type of position, broadly speaking? Especially when there's a piece on d5 that's a little bit loose. Yeah, the move queen b3 is one of the most commonly missed types of ideas in the opening. People just forget that this kind of move exists. I can show you a million examples. It's just a common source of a blunder. Thank you, Cardona Mamarosa, for the tier 1. Let's go. Why is this not dangerous here? Well, because I can take on f3. The bishop defends the knight, so white has to take and ruin the structure entirely. And here we can just go e6. And this is a classic sacrifice. Like queen takes b7 is just not dangerous. We go rook b8. And in return for this pawn, we have completely ruined white's structure. We can even just go bishop b7 here. White is totally undeveloped, and this knight can come to b4 at the right moment. It's just a bad position for white. It's not even full compensation. Black is just better. Black is just better. So that's how we would have dealt with queen b3. Bishop e2, e6, h3, and yeah, I would say that we're slightly better. Castles, bishop e7. Yeah, remember that in response to queen b3, you can actually sacrifice this pawn. You don't always have to automatically defend it. Okay, so he goes rook e1, castles. And yeah, bishop g5, I think, is the first serious mistake. It's not an easy position to play for white. Not at all. But maybe, I don't know, bishop e3, for example, is a move that I would entertain here for white. Just kind of accepting, yeah, the position sort of sucks, but I'm not going to trade any pieces unless it involves improving my pawn structure. So this, for example, is a pretty favorable trade for white. I just wanted to pull up an example of what can happen when you miss queen b3. Yeah, so what can happen when you miss queen b3? I had the Slav. Okay, I'm playing at 1200 in this game. And this is like California State Championship. But in the Slav, he goes bishop f5, which is a big mistake. And the reason it's a mistake is precisely because of queen b3. Yeah, this doesn't look like a dangerous move. My opponent goes b6. But watch how quickly black's position deteriorates. I go bishop f4, e6, and knight b5. After knight a6, the move queen a4 is simply crushing. And this is where he's paid the price for the move b6. Now the knight hangs. There is there's a discovery here, and bishop b4 checks, simply bishop d2. Okay. Again, obviously he blunders a piece and everything, but he's already totally lost. Just a little way to illustrate what I mean when I say that queen b3 could be dangerous. And after bishop g5 takes. Oh yeah, before I do this, I was going to explain why I didn't want to go g6. The reason I didn't want to go g6 has to do with the bishop being on g4. I've said this before, but I'm going to repeat it. When you fianchetto your bishop, it's often not a great combination of moves to have one bishop like this and the other bishop fianchettoed. Why? Because white plays h3. And the problem with the move g6, little known issue, is that you can never really play bishop h5 because of g4. So here you'd have to go back, But this is also a little bit awkward because even still white can go g4 and the bishop has to go further down this diagonal. But by playing g6, you take away that square from a bishop. And so you got to be careful about combining these moves. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Bishop g5, takes, rook d8, queen d3, g6. I still think that this position is very much holdable. This is a very big mistake because this simply does black's bidding for him. So how should white go about this position? Well, I think the only serious move is actually just rook d2. This is essentially forced because you have to stop the fork and defend the d2 pawn. And it's not so easy for black to make progress here. I think we would have played queen f4. And after knight f3, we probably would have doubled our rooks. Black is better, but white is holding. I mean, white is not losing the pawn yet. Yeah? So this is just not good. Knight takes d5, knight takes d4. Thank you, Brave Ulysses, for the 6 months. Let's go. And yeah, now we're just up a pawn, and this is a pretty brutal position to have to defend. Rook to c7 tactic, yes. Rook ec2, king g7. But the next point, what was I planning against rook c7? I was planning the move queen to e5. Okay, what the heck is that? You might be looking at this move and saying, okay, I get that it attacks the rook, but you're just plundering the pawn. Well, no, I'm not, because that queen's defending h2, so this is checkmate. Now you might say, okay, well, I'm going to be smarter than that. I'm going to take this pawn to the rook. And then if we trade rooks, well, then black will no longer have a back rank mate. But here, I was planning the move rook to d3, creating a highly unpleasant situation for white. The queen cannot leave contact with the d1 square. It's going to be mate. And if the queen drops back, I have rook d2. And black just gets a huge initiative here. The queen comes into e2. And in return for the pawn, black's position, I just verified this with the engine. White can hold on with queen a4, but here there is a really sexy tactic that involves the undefended rook on c1. I didn't see this during the game. Can anybody find it? Yeah, Flame Pelt definitely deserves a sub. Rook takes h3. Rook takes h3 out of nowhere. Loose pieces drop off. White's structure is ruined and black is winning. So this kind of stuff happens. So that's what I was planning. Dropping the queen back and creating the threat of back rank mate in order to defend the pawn indirectly. And final point that I want to make in this game, h5 to expand. Final point that I want to make in this game, very minor. Why did I put the king on f5 and not on e5? So one thing you have to be careful about when you're tying your rook down is to not allow this switcheroo. White gets the king to b2, and then white does the switcheroo, rook e1 check, and then the king drops back to a1, and this is a little bit harder to deal with because the rook is obviously a more annoying defensive piece than the king, so you don't want to allow that to happen. That's why I kept the king away from any possible checks. Okay, so that's the final subtlety. The rest is easy. All right, guys, thank you so much, and goodbye for now. Thanks for hanging out.